Hello and welcome. Today's webinar is Pedestrian Wayfinding under consideration of visual impairment, blindness, and deafblindness, a mixed method investigation into individual experiences and supporting elements. My name is Lacey Friedley. I am the Communications Coordinator at Portland State University's Transportation Research and Education Center. TREC leads the National Institute for Transportation and Communities, a university transportation center funded by the U.S. Department of Transportation. NITC consortium members, in addition to PSU, are the University of Utah, University of Oregon, University of Arizona, University of Texas at Arlington, and the Oregon Institute of Technology. NITC's research priority is improving mobility of people and goods to build strong communities. Our presenters today are Amy Parker and Martin Swobodzinski. Amy Parker is an assistant professor at PSU and the coordinator of the Orientation and Mobility Program in the Special Education Department. Her research interests include orientation and mobility for individuals with complex disabilities, communication interventions, participatory action research with people with disabilities and their families, and community-based partnerships to create social change. Martin Swobodzinski, an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Portland State University with a specialization in geographic information science. The overarching theme of Dr. Swobodzinski's scholarship and research is the investigation of technology as it mediates the spatial behavior, reasoning, and choice-making of individual human beings. Before diving into the webinar, I'd like to let you know about another upcoming online event. On March 10th, PSU's Orientation and Mobility Program and Visually Impaired Learning Program will host Mobility Matters 2023, an all-virtual conference where participants will explore ways to make natural spaces, parks, and community sites more accessible to all. Today's webinar will be a presentation with opportunities to ask questions at the end. So please type your questions in the Zoom Q&A box as they occur to you. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the video recording and presentation slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. A certificate of completion will be posted on the event page within 24 hours after the webinar ends. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much, Lacey, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I will be presenting today with Dr. Amy Parker as my co-presenter, and as I try to work my screen here. Okay, so start this. Please bear with me and go here. Share this over here. Now, I will be appearing that I'm looking into the off a little bit to this side. I'm not looking out of the window. I'm just having the Zoom window away so that I can focus on the slide. So I hope my gaze is not distracting here if it goes off into a different direction. All right, so again, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today to talk about and discuss our research on individual wayfinding in the particular context of visual impairment, blindness, and deafblindness. We are most grateful, of course, for the funding that we received for multiple years of research from NITC, in particular, as 2 subsequent grants whose content and deliverables will be those that we will discuss today. And also a very special thank you to our close friends and collaborators and colleagues at the American Printing House for the Blind, in particular, Elizabeth Schaller and Denise Snow, who I hope are in the audience today, but none of this would have been possible without this close collaboration and cooperation with our external partners in our funding, our funders, including NITC at the American Printing House for the Blind, and also Good Maps and other entities that made this research viable. The objective of our webinar today is going to be, to obviously talk about our research in this context of human wayfinding and vision loss, Our discussion points and insights going to be related to navigation preferences of travelers as it comes to visual impairment and those lived experiences that we observed in our different studies. We're also going to talk about some of the affordances in regard to what makes navigation, in particular pedestrian individual navigation in a real world setting viable, and hopefully generate and co-create some understanding around sustainable urban mobility in the sense of inclusion and accessibility across the population, with particular consideration on those with functional disability. Amy, do you want to say a few words in regard to motivation in addition?
Sure. This is Amy speaking. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you to NITC for hosting us. I think that many people in our field of orientation and mobility have written about human wayfinding. Certainly in some of our foundational text, it's been written about as an attempt to understand how people organize space. But for us, it was really important to talk more with the community. So our approach has been over multi-years, as Martin was saying, a layered approach where we've had points of talking to the community, points of doing a systematic literature review to see what other scholars have written about, looking at the marketplace supports that have been available. And we know that human wayfinding is in itself complex process. And then as we'll describe to you, we actually did investigations with some real journeys that people took behaviorally on our campus. So these are organizing activities that all human beings engage in, right? Whether you have a vision loss or not, whether you have any mobility impairment or mobility challenge or not, human wayfinding is a complex cognitive process. We can go ahead, Martin.
Yeah. So in terms of adding to what Amy said, these type of activities that we engage in daily in terms of going to places and finding places are also joined by the ubiquity of tools that are available but not universally accessible and usable or useful. And our particular motivation was also stemming from a consideration for all of these mobile individual type of technologies, communication technologies that we have in our pockets, or many of us have in our pockets, and to test and probe and create inventories around what's actually out there and what are the user experiences in regard to what the functionality that is provided by these tools or in these technologies, and what the individual experiences are with those. Now, when I say technology, it's not just about mobile tech, it's also a widespread type of gamut of different technologies in regard to primary and secondary type of mobility tools. So our understanding, conceptualization of technology in this case was sure mobile technology, but also, acknowledging orientation mobility practices very much so in regard to what it is that folks use to get around, to make them safe and efficient and feel confident and reassured as they engage in these complex and often frustrating type of activities.
Martin, I'll just add very quickly that on the screen visually right now, there is a typical smartphone device that you see positioned in a car that's connected. You see individuals, they happen to be deafblind, who are traveling at the Amtrak station in Portland, Oregon, using long canes, and some folks who are working with guide dogs and canes, and they're boarding an Amtrak train. There's also an image up of a high relief map that's positioned at the Portland International Airport, where there's high contrast print and braille and tactile markings that offer a visualization tactually of the space. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, on a personal note, just to add to my own motivation, this is a slide that shows pictures from the early 2000s of a mentor and advisor of mine, Professor Reginald Golledge, He was a faculty member at the UC Santa Barbara at the University of California at Santa Barbara, and I just happened to be in an advisory role with him in the early 2010s or so. And this series of pictures shows early contraptions, we would want to say, of makeshift combinations of hardware that can be put into a backpack and involves a large GPS antenna, a headset, and other type of cables that connect those different pieces. Back in the 2000s, those were some of the first solutions in regard to individual pedestrian mobility for outdoor navigation. So this is a glimpse at a history 20 years back when Reg was working on with his group for many years on these different type of pieces of user hardware type of interfaces. And the interesting and curious part for me is that the appearance and the bulkiness of what they tried to establish back then in terms of positioning, like how do you make sure that we know where you are in space as you travel outdoors? These are still concerns for us today, obviously. Most of these type of hardware innovations and developments will now be baked into our mobile devices. But visually later on, I have a few more slides from more recent developments where if you just look at the appearance and the bulk of the hardware that is used for this outdoor navigation piece, you will see or find quite similarities in regard to what needs to be done to afford any kind of indoor navigation. All right, so thank you, Reg. For me, this is also, my work is also memory work. So I respected that man a great deal. So to give you an overview in regard to, we are talking about 4 years of investigations, ramping up to doing these 2 projects. And as it comes to the supplementation of our own expertises and those of our external partners, we approach these different, this kind of complex environment in investigation with different lenses, and always such that we wanted to account for as much of the complexity as we can in regard to individual experiences pertaining to wayfinding. Now, obviously, Amy's and my type of backgrounds are quite different, but they are very supportive and supplemental in regard to how we think about the interaction with individuals and trying to capture their experiences. So what we did in these multiple years, we did extensive literature reviews of the academic literature, but also of digital marketplaces. We held many focus groups in combination with sometimes the experimental procedures that we engaged with. We had a very intensive type of case study that we will discuss today as well, and then leading us to scaling up this study in the void of prescribed type of methodologies that would say or allow us, hey, how would you do this with, let's say, 30 participants or so. So one piece of information that is really important here is there was no recipe for us to engage with this work. It was a lot of motivation and an initiative to roll it out, and that kind of structured how we went about these layers of investigations in regard to human wayfinding and visual impairment. So in a few years back, with our first grant, again, thank you to NITC for making this possible. Our focus was on systematic reviews of the marketplaces, digital marketplaces, and conducting focus groups in regard to the overall experiences of individuals around mobile apps. So in this particular, the technology, the wayfinding aids were those that were accessible through or gatherable and findable through digital marketplaces, in particular the Google Marketplace, as well as the Apple iOS marketplaces, in combination with exploration into the academic literature in regard to what kind of testing has been done, what kind of inventories are out there and products are out there. Amy, do you have?
I would just say, I would
Question?
just add to what Martin is saying that as you all know, as soon as you start using an app, what do we know about the apps? They constantly are iterating, they constantly are updating, constantly are changing. So it kind of felt like we were trying to grab smoke with our hands as we were looking through the literature, because we might find studies in peer review that did have one particular type of app, but then that app doesn't exist anymore. So we know that kind of organizing this material, as soon as you've organized it one time, there are new apps and exciting apps on the marketplace. But that also makes it hard to wrap our hands around how people use wayfinding. But as you go to the next slide, Martin, the exciting part that we found in working is that there were a lot of truths across multiple different types of apps. I will say that we are posting accessible slides on the NITC website that you all can have access to. This other material that's presented is all accessible to you. It's all available in open access reports. This particular screen has a matrix. If you imagine a matrix with multiple cells, and the cells all have application names of different types of wayfinding apps that have been used, that were reported on in the literature. Then we also categorize those as, are they high cost or low cost? Are they free? And then what types of systems are compatible with that wayfinding software? Are there additional hardwares that are needed? And was the wayfinding support used for outdoor navigation, for indoor navigation, or for both? So in this vast little forest, you can see, just as a visual snapshot, that there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of apps that are available, some that are still alive and well today, like IRA, like Apple Maps, which is ubiquitous, which the whole community uses, right? There's Ariadne, there's Be My Eyes, which is still very much used, but then there are some that have faded from use or have been refined and taken on a new name, such as Good Maps, that was iterated out of Indoor Maps and Nearby Explorer from the Printing House for the Blind. We can go to the next slide, Martin. And we're moving along pretty quickly through this review, because we want to get to where we actually did some, not only focus groups, but we really did some behavioral testing of wayfinding experiences. So in sum, our structured review of these apps, we found some real differences in what they provide. Some of them were useful for one or two areas of wayfinding and functionality. Some had a very distinct separation between indoor and outdoor navigation, which became difficult as anyone who's traveling and relying on these apps know, that going from indoor to outdoor settings can be a real challenge where you lose connection. And then few addressed certain information needs, but they were not necessarily good at addressing all of the needs for a complete trip. And we'll talk a little bit about the complete trip. Martin, do you want to advance to the next slide? And you're welcome. This is a synthesis of this complete trip model. Now, this synthesis, it was created out of multiple years of work from the U.S. Department of Transportation, which has a project that's called A-Tree. And A-Tree had a special focus on innovation with people with disabilities, how to solve complex problems. And what they noticed in their multiple years of work is that, taking a trip is it sounds like it's one thing that you need to do, but there are actually multiple phases to that. There's planning and booking a trip. There's travel to an actual transit station. There's the actual ride on the bus or the other type of transit mode that's being used. There's street crossing, which we know in orientation and mobility is one of those huge areas of focus in terms of safety and decision-making and having access to real-time environmental information. And then there's the actual arrival at a destination. So when we looked at our structured review of apps, we were seeing that certain apps were good at one or two of these aspects, but none were good at all of these aspects in kind of an integrative way. And then this was followed up on the next slide when we talked with focus groups. So we hosted focus groups with visually impaired consumers, blind, low vision. Then we hosted a focus group with individuals who are deafblind. And we also hosted a focus group with orientation and mobility specialists. And you know what we found? We did audio and video recordings. We'll go to the next slide. We used a naturalistic approach. So in other words, we didn't want this to be some kind of stiff or formal survey type of response that people needed to respond to. We just wanted people to really talk about their experiences in travel. And from the orientation and mobility perspective, we wanted orientation and mobility specialists to share with us what they had observed across clients that they served. And of course, some of our orientation and mobility specialists also have visual impairment themselves or vision loss. Let's go to the next slide. So as we transcribed and analyzed the apps, we looked at what people said and what came up from the apps perspective and the devices that they shared. And across the groups, there were some differences that we saw, and you can look more at some of these differences and nuances. So blind and visually impaired consumers mentioned soundscape. This is not a surprise, right? Where deafblind consumers did not mention soundscape, where they mentioned more Move It as an app that they were using. Both groups used Google Maps, Apple Maps. That was some of the consistency across all three groups. And then the deafblind consumer group also talked about the need for more tactile support, which is also not a surprise, or a way to translate auditory information from the environment into vibrotactile information or Braille. Okay, let's go ahead. And so here was one of the big takeaways. People, because as we saw from that complete trip model that we were just discussing, people use multiple sources as a means of navigation. What was really interesting about that was talking about how none of the apps were a standalone tool, but they were a part of a multi-sensory system and information system that travelers were using individually. We also saw that, or what they shared with us, was that people use multiple apps simultaneously. And that's for some of the more savvy travelers who were very comfortable using apps. In some other groups, we saw that one person might use one app kind of faithfully. And then when they got stuck maybe in using that app, then they had to resort to other means of support, such as soliciting assistance or gathering other information. One woman told a very dramatic story of when she was lost when going to a high pressure appointment. She was going to meet with a lawyer. She happened to be deafblind, and she talked about when she lost access to one of her tried and true apps, the one that she mainly relied on, she had to switch very suddenly to using Google Maps, and that was actually successful for her. So she had a real positive experience in that moment of really needing to find her way and being disoriented. Let's go to the next slide, Martin. And we're kind of going through this very quickly, and I'm going to shift it back to Martin very soon. But it was fascinating to hear that apps have a benefit for everyone in increasing environmental knowledge and literacy, what we call environmental literacy, simply knowing what's available to you in the immediate environment, having more dynamic support. So in real time, having the in the moment support, just like that traveler who described that she was lost and disoriented, her app was no longer functioning, the one she was comfortable with, and then she moved over to Google and she was able to receive some support that she needed in the moment. And then increased supports, and this is not a surprise to anyone, right? The use of planning routes ahead of time. Those complex routes in urban environments take a lot of thought, right? Take the whole complete trip model that we were talking about. Yes, let's go on. And then the challenges, folks did mention several challenges with using apps, accessing a small screen for people who have low vision, who still are relying visually, manipulating features on the phone. So those fine motor skills that one has in navigating their phone or using the double tap features were challenging, dropped signals, and unreliability of some of the apps. And that's not a surprise to those that are listening. Some of the apps were not very adaptable. They had a lack of adaptability for customization, which was frustrating. So people were either getting too much information that wasn't helpful and was sometimes distracting on their journey, and they couldn't customize that to their own unique needs. And we'll go to the next slide. So this is our summarization, our summary, I should say, of what people found. Folks mentioned something cool was a killer navigation app that they wanted. That was an integration of all these different features and functionalities of the apps that they were using in pieces. Deafblind folks said that they wanted an easy interface of Braille with more vibratory features. As we mentioned, folks mentioned they wanted to learn routes and reduce their stress. And folks mentioned they wanted better coverage in a rural area. Martin, I'll let you go on to the next slides.
Yeah, and part of the aspects that weren't necessarily considered within our initial conceptualization of these wayfinding experiences, also the social aspects of what these different technologies afford. So it's not just informing your own wayfinding as you engage individually in these activities with mobility, but it's also in regard to the empowerment that they provide in regard to being able to, hey, I can give my relatives or my friends directions, suggestions where to go, where to eat. So again, this type of access of information in the moment and space-based was conceived as very very empowering and very desirable. And of course, that would then directly relate to some of the desires that were expressed, that we wish there was a killer app that would give us and deliver and speak to all of our needs, information needs, and goal-directed type of tasks that we engage with as we travel. But of course, such doesn't exist, as we will further discuss within this webinar. So based on these insights, we geared up to a larger grant that was particularly focused on 2 research questions, considering that there's this artificial separation in terms of research traditions in technology development between outdoor and indoor, which, you know, we acknowledge that there's stark differences in regard to the experiences of individuals as they transition from one place to the other, but understanding what the technological shortfalls are, if there are any, and if that artificial separation actually maps onto any kind of individual experiences as well. How is outdoors different from indoors, and how does technology in the broader sense allow us to be leveraged in regard to making this type of transition and the overall experience as you travel indoor-outdoor routes more effective, more enjoyable in a way, and less frustrating. And then considering that we had a particular focus on real-world type of experiences within the confines of a safe type of experimental framework, that we also wanted to think about as we thought about our campus at Portland State as a urban campus that is embedded within the urban fabric, that it would provide a platform and a laboratory to do real-world type of routes and experiences that are akin to those that students and visitors would engage with in everyday type of situations on campus as they visit or go to classes and peruse these public spaces. So what is it that we need to do to even deploy any kind of technology and assess it within these individual experiences? So our concept of the study was then based on a comparative type of setup in regard to orientation mobility practice, in which, you know, verbal instructions and written instructions are oftentimes used to relate routes to customers. So we had a written instruction modality of route descriptions. We also had tactile maps that we created conveying notions of a route that we asked individuals to complete. And then we also brought in mobile technology, in particular in that situation, Nearby Explorer by our friends at the American Printing House for the Blind, to see how we can have folks and participants travel from outdoors to indoors on routes that we devised, that we assumed to be comparable, so that we could truly tease out wayfinding behavior and experiences and performance related to these three type of modalities. So in this case, as I mentioned before, there was no prescribed recipe and methodological framework to work with. There were components, just like outdoor and indoor was separated within technological developments. It was separated for mostly tractable type of reasons of scoping research studies, so that outdoor and indoor was also developed separately and researched separately. And we said, well, we want to go one step further and see what it is that makes outdoor special versus indoor. In consideration also that a particular focus emerged in many different type of communities pertaining to a focus on indoor navigation, given that certain technological developments were there that allowed even some kind of mobile-based app type of leveraging of these external technologies to even make indoor navigation and positioning and routing possible. So our main focus then at the midpoint of our project was to invite and intensely focus on one particular case study. So we had a 32-year-old male participant who was deafblind. He was advantageously blind with Usher syndrome type 2 and retinitis pigmentosa. So his over the course of his life, his visual acuity and function was deteriorating. So that was definitely on the forefront of his mind, to be prepared for the time when he might maybe lose further vision down the road that he fully expected. And he wanted to be as engaged in and be as initiative, if that's a word, to make sure that he is in a strong position to be able to have everything in place, so that he would be able to continue with his highly active type of activities around entrepreneurial type of wayfinding development. All right, so he was a Braille user. It's transitioning using Braille. He had some experience, but less so with tactile maps. And given that he was very much into technology and wayfinding apps, he deemed himself very knowledgeable on mobile apps and their use, and was mostly relying on screen readers to access information on smaller devices and textual information that is digital. So in this slide, we have an overview of the three modalities as a visual type of impression of what it was. So a long list really of verbal descriptions, stepwise broken down from 1 to 17 for one particular route, giving you step-by-step type of instructions that might be those that were related to you by an orientation mobility instructor. And that is also very important, because our group was comprised of professionals, researchers, and practitioners in that field. So we used best practices in regard to real-world type of alike scenarios in regard to, this is a route that you might have to take from one of the buildings to next to access some student-facing type of services on the campus. And these would be the instructions that might be related to you if you were to travel that route by an orientation mobility instructor. Now, then further, we had the app-based, mobile-based type of considerations with certain limitations in regard to even functionality for indoor navigation. So at that point, we used Nearby Explorer by APH to facilitate some of the routes, in conjunction with some external hardware that made it possible to allow for indoor navigation at the very beginning of, or early beginnings of the developments of technology in that realm. And then a tactile map, and those are also very complex, and there's a lot of research obviously on those. So they come in any forms and fashions, basically. We used wiki sticks in swell paper to create ours. Swell paper is a thermally activated ink that you put on paper. You send it through the swell machine, and it raises the lines in the ink that you drew on those papers. And then for further readability and expression of symbology in a map context, we used wiki sticks that we created by hand to emphasize destinations and landmarks to the best of our ability in regard to understanding what might be important to guide you and allow you to complete these routes as you travel from your origin to your destination. Let's see. Now, the next slide is a visual representation of a digital map of the routes that we devised, the Aldir routes in this case. So for the most part, they were such that they started outdoors at different points on the inner part of the Portland State campus, meaning on or around the park blocks. If you're familiar with that area, between Broadway in the Southwest Broadway on the east and 10th Avenue on the west, and Montgomery Street on the north and Southwest Hall Street on the south. So basically a 4, 5, 6 block type of squarish area that we had available to us that didn't require any crossings in terms of traffic, no street crossings in regard to actual traffic going on those roads, but allowed us to devise fairly complex routes in regard to traversing from one side of the park blocks to another, or from one building to another, that would allow access to services such as the library, or, as I said, student-facing services in the Faribush Mezi Hall, which is the hub for all student-facing type of services on campus. Now, one particular experimental consideration there is, how do you tease out the effect and the complexity of a route being traveled, and then in conjunction with assessing anything in regard to the performance of these type of route completion tasks and wayfinding type of performance, if I may phrase it that way, in regard to what the route does in terms of making it easier or more difficult. So one particular consideration for us was to hone in and use best judgments in regard to academic type of practices as it comes, and orientation mobility practices as it comes to devising comparable routes that are comparable in complexity. Now, within the, again, very, very much confines of what that might mean metric wise. So for us, it boiled down to, at that point of our study, to make the routes of similar length and to have similar number of turns, assuming that these would then map onto similar complexity, so that if we scale this study up, we would be able to unpack differences in regard to, what is it that the wayfinding instructions did that were delivered and consumed, so to speak, verbally versus the mobile app and their performance, including all of the issues that might be much more subjected to the the mobile-based applications in regard to GPS reception and whatnot versus any of the other modalities. The next few slides are just visual representations of stepwise type of progression through one of the routes. So they show you traveling from the entrance, Broadway Street entrance of Smith Hall towards Faribush Mezi Hall with a few turns, entering the building, following a ramp that is devised there to make the little mezzanine level of that student services level accessible, turning around and finally reaching a desk as your destination where you could inquire about certain student services, including registration and so. So again, a consideration there was to make this a plausible route that might be useful for folks on campus on a daily basis, without in particular knowing this route in particular. So we had no assumption about familiarity with the campus. In fact, we assumed that most folks would not be familiar with the campus, or only coincidentally because they might have been students or such on campus. Amy?
Yes, absolutely. The qualitative and quantitative analysis from this study really were working in tandem together. And if you could go to the next slide, Martin. We used a convergent parallel approach, which means we considered the quantitative and behavioral data, the data that came in from surveys, as well as the qualitative data, which is what people said on routes and information from our focus group, to compare and contrast those themes so that we could have an intertwined analysis. Next slide. Martin, this is another image of the routes kind of in a large aerial view of the 3 different routes on campus. I will just add that one of the interesting things about our study, and we know this in orientation and mobility, is that college campuses are one of the most complex areas for navigation. As our transit centers, as our airports. We've known that for a long time from the community's knowledge. So that was also an impetus in looking at these different comparable routes. And the feedback was really interesting, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Next slide, Martin.
Yeah, if I may, one major observation from this case study and the intensity that we were able to apply to it with the video recordings that we captured of the experience of the individual traveling these 3 different routes that were randomly assigned to the 3 different modalities, and then a follow-up focus, or in this case, an interview type of settings to debrief the participant in regard to their experience, in regard to, you know, how confident were you, how comfortable, what are some of the pieces of information that you used. One observation that we had in regard to separation between these 3 different modalities that was somewhat surprising to us was the small amount of errors that were related to the use of the tactile map. Even though our participant said he was fairly unfamiliar with them, he very much appreciated the tactile haptic in-time type of affordances that the map had. He would have the tactile map on his chest and feel, you know, what is it that the information is being conveyed on that map is, as he was asked to complete these routes. And a takeaway from this was very high satisfaction with the tactile map, very low errors committed in terms of what we classified as errors, and a very short completion time in the ballpark of 9 minutes for that particular route, which was about 5 to 7 minutes or so, roughly less than the other routes. So half the amount of errors committed, and pretty much 70% of the time used to complete the route, which was surprising to us. But in this case, you know, it is a interplay between the amount and usefulness and reliability of the information provided in regard to landmarks as you are asked to complete these routes, versus the information affordances with these different pieces of technology. So our takeaway, and for the sake of time, I guess I'm going to speed up a little bit. Our main insights then in regard to honing in on a research design that will allow us to scale this type of study up to more than 1 participant, including, you know, the video recordings and transcription and analysis of the recordings, both audio and video of these experiences, individual experiences, is that, you know, it's paramount, the simplicity of the tool to minimize cognitive load. How much does it map onto the use of a primary mobility tool, and how much does it supplement or muffle potentially any kind of environmental type of information? Clearly, the amount of visual perception that our participant has was also informing certain expectations in regard to the information being provided. And one large shortfall, in fact, in regard to the low performance, at least as it comes to the confidence and reflection on the participant, was related to the mobile app. And in fact, one of the lessons learned there was that we, for the purpose of full communication of the name and the purpose of the project, we phrased the whole experiences as seamless navigation indoors and outdoors. So it set a certain expectation for this participant to expect really high, reliable, and useful and usable type of mobile technology. This is the tool that will allow me to do all the things that I need to do indoors and outdoors. However, of course, we knew that seamless navigation is aspirational as it comes to outdoor and indoor. And one takeaway was that it is really important to manage the expectations of our participants, even if it's as innocent as relating the names of projects, to not present something that any type of tool might not be able to live up to. Yeah, so I will continue to the scaling up of the study. So one important takeaway is, the conjunction and the interfacing of the tool in which the mobile, the tactile map was such that it really mapped well onto the task at hand, the completion of a route, following a route, and turn-by-turn type of instruction to get to the final destination was such that the task and the technology meshed very well together, versus some of these type of separations that we had to engage with technology-wise between outdoor and indoor, necessarily, that maybe were not such that they mapped onto the expectations and the information needs of the participant in relation to the affordances and the functionality of the tool. So as we then scaled up our study for the last final slides, we learned our lessons and had also tremendous differences in regard to the technological affordances that we saw that made our study possible. Based on consultations with a orientation and mobility practitioner and participant / travel expert, we boiled down to reduce fatigue and the involvement that was part of our experimental design to the two most prominent type of modalities, meaning we dropped the verbal descriptions from our comparative type of analysis and looked specifically at a new mobile app that afforded more precise and more sophisticated indoor navigation. In this case, Nearby Explorer evolved to Good Maps. Good Maps Explorer, which was a tool that uses digital representations that were captured of some of the buildings on campus to afford indoor routing, turn-by-turn type of instructions, among other functionalities. So again, our thank you to Good Maps, our external partners that stepped in at that point to make this possible as part of the some of the necessities that had to be created in regard to digital representations of indoor spaces. So we were left with two support tools and extended our recruitment to both youth and adults. In specifically some of the local schools for the blind, including, again, very much a great thank you to Steve Lowry and others at the Washington State School for the Blind to have participants come in to engage with our experimental study. Amy?
Yes, this study would not have been possible. We had a nice comment in the chat pod, and I do apologize for any background noise. It's kind of a situation where I'm in someone's home right now, a family member's home, who is needing some health care. The inclusion of youth and adults was an important component in this study. Someone asked in the chat about the differences between adults and younger folks, adolescents. Now, when I've asked this at different meetings, I've asked questions like, who do you think was faster? And most people, if you answered in the chat, you would say, who was faster? Do you think the adults were faster on the routes, or do you think that the young adults were faster? I'm just giving you a pause, and it may not be rocket science to say that most folks agreed that the young adults, the adolescents, were faster, and that is indeed true, that the folks who were 14 to 18 years old were faster. And then the adults who were between the ages of 19 or 50 were a little bit slower on the routes. One of the interesting components of this part of our study was that we also asked about confidence. I've loved working with Martin over the years because we do have different backgrounds and different expertise. The UC Santa Barbara scale, which we will share with you, was also used by folks to measure confidence. And the UC Santa Barbara scale has a high level of reliability and validity for travelers, including travelers with visual impairments. It was kind of a new scale to me in orientation and mobility, and I have found it kind of interesting to think about someone's confidence, because so much of mobility involves that. We also, as we did these individual routes with folks, we completed focus groups. And so some of the interesting part was, even though there was a notable difference in the performance data of the way young adults performed faster, who do you think was more confident on the UC Santa Barbara confidence scale? And I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay, I'm going to check the chat. Well, this relates to one of the questions that the anonymous attendee put in the chat. The older adults were more confident on the routes. So that's what was an interesting layer to our study, was to compare that performance in terms of speed doesn't necessarily always correlate or connect in this way to confidence. One of the exciting pieces of the study to me was that the study was socially valid for people. To a person, everyone that came to the campus to engage with us in these focus groups and in these routes and these different conditions to talk with us about it, said it had some validity for them. It had some meaning. It had some purpose. That was really fun to talk with the high schoolers who were thinking ahead to life as an adult, perhaps life on a college campus, as well as to talk with the older adults who said, yeah, it was kind of neat to challenge myself on these routes and to talk with other people about my lived experience. Let's go on to the next slide, Martin. And I will just close by saying on my part, another interesting finding was that those who had teachers or orientation and mobility specialists who came to be a part of the process with them also found some ideas and ways to follow up with people who were interested. There were a lot of environmental factors. Again, we did not choose to do this in a laboratory. We did not choose to do this in controlled conditions. These were complex conditions where we had rain and wind. It's Portland, Oregon. We found the global findings were that people do assemble mental maps through their experiences and questions that they ask themselves. Cognitive load is always a big factor when people are using different devices of any kind, whether it be a tactile map, whether it be a wayfinding app, whether it be, which we had eliminated as Martin was saying, based on an expert's advice, we eliminated the written directions or the verbal directions that people could use and just compared the two conditions. As I mentioned to you, while speed is a performance measure, the efficiency, it's not always correlated with confidence and confirmation. So the older adults in general were a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more paced on the routes, and maybe took some more time to use the tools, and also felt a greater degree of confidence that they were going to find their way than the young adults were. And Martin, I don't know if you want to talk about the significance of the UC Santa Barbara scale.
Yeah, so one of the preliminary insights was to, as Amy said, gauge and use this instrument of the Santa Barbara sense of direction scale to give an impression, an excerpt of what it is in regard to maybe if you're working in as a practitioner or a researcher in that field. It's a universal instrument to gauge sense of direction. And we know that sense of direction is related to confidence in regard to self-estimation, in regard to how successful am I going to be and how successful have I been in the past in regard to wayfinding. So it's a short 15-item questionnaire, uses a Likert scale of agreement to disagreement. And some of the statements that you might answer to is, I'm not very good at reading maps. Do you agree or not on 1 to 7? And do you have a poor memory of where you left things? So it's a very beneficial type of instrument to at least gauge. And what we found to gauge the sense of direction, what we found is these stark differences between the young adults and the youth that were participating in our study and those participants that recruited among the adults. And you might not be surprised that, you know, people that also volunteer to be part of these type of experiences are those expert travelers. They are coming around and walking around and engaging in the daily type of activities, versus maybe those students that we invited from the State School of the Blind in regard to just acquiring and getting comfortable with being independent type of travelers, at least more so than our adult participants. Right, and that has certain implications in terms of research design, of course, but for us, it's very important to make a point that youth need to be part of a partnership of facilitating experiences and research experiences, but also lived type of experiences in regard to engagement with public spaces, developing environmental literacy, in particular as it comes to this journey to adulthood that we know is very complex in regard to college readiness and career readiness. Okay, so to conclude, we have seen tremendous changes in the technological type of affordances of our study, going from some hardware that needed to be put into place in different buildings to allow for some kind of positioning and routing of people, to tremendous type of situations and developments in regard to scanning indoor spaces with help of our partners. And just to conclude the loop here, sorry for switching back and forth, but I'm going to go back to one of these images in regard to a visual representation of some of the tools that we use these days, just within the span of 2 to 4 years of mapping indoor spaces so that we have digital representations that we can put into a mobile device. Here is a series of pictures, 2 of them of our collaborator, Jeremiah Rose, who is with Good Maps, who came in to scan indoor spaces of a whole building, top to bottom, across 4 or 5 floors in our Smith Student Memorial Building, with a contraption that visually at least appears to be very similar to what we saw with those contraptions that I described in the beginning in the early 2000s, used for outdoor navigation, but the functionality is such vastly different. It's looks like an antenna in a backpack with a lot of batteries and cables connected to it, and somebody has strapped that, Jeremiah has strapped it to his back. Now, the very difference is that technology now affords these very detailed representation of indoor spaces that then can be processed to allow for some kind of digital representation of these spaces and then afford routing through mobile apps. Now, all of that is complex and time consuming and cost factors that need to be taken into account. So we again grateful that these type of pieces were allowed us to have our external partners come in and for us to conclude our research on this type of case. For our final reflections, and again, sorry for stressing on time right now. Now, one major insight is that, you know, our study was meant to co-create knowledge and understanding in regard to seamless navigation, to give voice to our participants, to not create lab-like situations, but rather more real life type of situations, so that there can be enrichment also in terms of the individual experiences and not just the observations that we gathered in our research. A great desire for technology and integration and customization remains. We are not there where we can say seamless navigation as we hope there would be between autos and doors is in fact in place. As I said, a lot of technological affordances need to be in place to allow for mobile apps in particular to afford any kind of routing or guidance of individuals. Development are rapid, but what it takes is also a diverse understanding of the ways of knowing and doing, and that can only happen through a number of interdisciplinary events such as the one here, and our research activities were particularly geared towards allowing for these type of experiences to happen and take place. Amy, any final words?
No, just we're very grateful for our partners. I've been typing some chat responses to our participants. Our participatory design is a great value with the community. I just want to close with saying a lack of engagement can also be expensive. Sometimes people think, oh, we're just going to shortcut this and really design quickly without including the community. But by doing that, you really are limiting the use of the tool that you've designed. So we've learned so much. This is our acknowledgement slide. We are able to respond verbally to some questions, Martin, if you want to see any of the questions and respond verbally, and I'm also happy to respond.
Yeah, so I played the ball back to Lacey at track and Becca in regard to our options, or in regard to time. I want to be very conscientious. Again, sorry for using up the time to the extent that we did, but
No.
we do appreciate very much your attendance and attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. It was a good presentation. Amy, I appreciate your addressing so many of the Q&A questions in the chat. And if anyone does want to follow up, they can always email us at AskTrek, and we're able to pass on more questions to the speakers. So thanks very much for your presentation, and I'm going to end that there. Everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.